Okay, that would be why. I'd turned on or turned off my external capture in order to let me hear myself. So that was a bit awkward, but hey, Lobu. So as I was saying, I'm Jack, and I am a panda. Although currently I'm a red panda, I've got someone working on some edits for the model and some textures, which will help me look a little bit more like my usual self. It's going to take a month or two though, so I'm hoping to get it done soon enough. And we were going to read Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy again tonight, because I was enjoying it last time. And also, what we were up to. Arthur and Ford had gotten onto the Vogon spaceship thanks to the Dentrassi. And unfortunately, Ford thought that he could hear the Vogons coming towards them. And he says that, well, if they're lucky, the people approaching are just the Vogons come to throw them into space. And if they're unlucky, then they're probably going to read them some of their poetry first. And given that Vogon poetry is the third worst in the universe, the second worst being the Asgoths of Kriya, it's probably not going to end well for them either way. So, we may as well get started. The second worst is that of the Asgoths of Kriya. During a recitation by their poet master Gronthos, the Flatulent, of his poem Ode to a Small Lump of Green Putty I Found in My Armpit One Midsummer Morning, 4 of his audience members died of internal hemorrhaging, and the president of the Mid-Galactic Arts Nobbling Council survived by gnawing off one of his own legs. Gronthos is reported to have been disappointed by his poem's reception, and was about to embark on a reading of his 12-book epic entitled My Favourite Bath Time Gurgles, when his own major intestine, in a desperate attempt to save life and civilization, leapt straight up through his neck and throttled his brain. The very worst poetry of all perished along with its creator, Paula Nancy Millstone Jennings of Greenbridge, Essex, England, in the destruction of planet Earth. Prostetnik Volgan Jeltz smiled very slowly. This was done not so much for effect as because he was trying to remember the sequence of muscle movements. He had had a terribly therapeutic yell at his prisoners and was now feeling quite relaxed and ready for a little callousness. The prisoners sat in the poetry appreciation chairs, strapped in. Vogon suffered no illusions as to the regard of their works were generally held in. Their early attempts at composition had been part of a bludgeoning insistence that they be accepted as a properly evolved and cultured race, but now the only thing that kept them going was sheer bloody-mindedness. The sweat stood out on Ford Prefect's brow and slid round the electrodes strapped to his temples. These were attached to a battery of electronic equipment, imagery intensifiers, rhythmic modulators, alliterative residulators, and simile dumpers, all designed to heighten the experience of the poem and make sure that not a single nuance of the poet's thought was lost. Arthur Dent sat and quivered. He had no idea what he was in for, but he knew that he hadn't liked anything that had happened so far, and didn't think things were likely to change. The Vogon began to read, a fetid little passage of his own devising. "Oh, Freddled Gruntbugly," he began. Spasms racked Ford's body. This was worse than even he'd been prepared for. "Thy martuations are to me as plurdled gabblebloch. It's on a lurgid bee." "Ah!" went Ford Prefect, wrenching his head back as lumps of pain thumped through it. He could dimly see beside him Arthur lolling and rolling in his seat. He clenched his teeth. "Group, I implore thee," continued the merciless Vogon. "My funting turlingdromes." His voice was rising to a horrible pitch of impassioned stridency. "And hooptiously drangle me with crinkly birdle wordles, or I will rend thee in gobblewots with my blurgen cruncheon. See if I don't." cried Ford Prefect, and threw one last final spasm as the electronic enhancement of the last line caught him full blast across the temples. He went limp. Arthur lolled. No, not laughter. You know, collapsing nearly. Now, Earthlings, whirred the Vogon. He didn't know that Ford Prefect was in fact from a small planet somewhere within the vicinity of Betelgeuse. Sent you with a simple choice. Either die in the vacuum of space, or... He paused for melodramatic effect. Tell me how good you thought my poem was. He threw himself backwards into a huge leathery bat-shaped seat and watched them. He did the smile again. Ford was rasping for breath. He rolled his dusty tongue around his parched mouth and moaned. Arthur said brightly, Actually, I quite liked it. Ford turned and gaped. Here was an approach that had quite simply not occurred to him. The Vogon raised a surprised eyebrow that effectively obscured his nose and was therefore no bad thing. Oh, good, he whirred in considerable astonishment. Oh, yes, said Arthur. I thought that some of the metaphysical imagery was really particularly effective. Ford continued to stare at him, slowly organising his thoughts around this totally new concept. Were they really going to be able to bareface their way out of this? Yes, do continue, invited the Vogon. Oh, and, interesting rhythmic devices too, continued Arthur, which seem to counterpoint the, he floundered. Ford leaped to his rescue, hazarding, counterpoint the surrealism of the underlying metaphor of the, He floundered too, but Arthur was ready again. Humanity of the... Voginity? Oh, Voginity, Ford hissed at him. Ah, yes, Voginity, sorry. Of the poet's compassionate soul, Arthur felt he was on a home stretch now, which contrives through the medium of the verse structure to sublimate this, transcend that, and come to terms with the fundamental dichotomies of the other. He was reaching a triumphant crescendo. And one is left with a profound and vivid insight into... which suddenly gave out on him. Ford leaped in with the coup de grace. Into whatever it was the poem was about, he yelled out the corner of his mouth. Well done, Arthur. That was very good. The Vogon perused them. For a moment his embittered racial soul had been touched, but he thought, no, too little, too late. His voice took on the quality of a cat snagging brushed nylon. So what you're saying is that I write poetry because underneath my mean, callous, heartless exterior, I really just want to be loved, he said. He paused. Is that right? Ford laughed a nervous laugh. Well, yes, he said. Don't we all deep down know... The Vogon stood up. No, well, you're completely wrong, he said. I write poetry to throw my mean, callous, heartless exterior into sharp relief. I'm going to throw you off the ship anyway. Guard, take the prisoner to number 3 airlock and throw them out. What? Shouted Ford. A huge young Vogon guard stepped forward and yanked them out of the straps with his huge, blubbery arms. You can't throw us into space, yelled Ford. We're trying to write a book. Resistance is useless, shouted the Vogon guard back at him. It was the first phrase he'd learnt when he joined the Vogon Guard Corps. The captain watched with detached amusement and then turned away. Arthur stared around him wildly. I don't want to die now, he yelled. I've still got a headache. I don't want to go to heaven with a headache. I'd be all cross and wouldn't enjoy it. The guard grasped them both firmly around the neck and, bowing deferentially towards the captain's back, hoiked them both protesting off the bridge. A steel door closed, and the captain was on his own again. He hummed quietly and mused to himself, lightly fingering the notebook of verses. He said. Counterpoint the surrealism of the underlying metaphor? He considered this for a moment, and then closed the book with a grim smile. That's too good for them, he said. The long, steel-lined corridor echoed to the feebly struggles of the two humanoids clamped firmly under rubbery Vogon armpits. "This is great," spluttered Arthur. "This is really terrific." "Let go of me, you brute!" The Vogon guard dragged them on. "Don't you worry," said Ford. "I'll think of something." He didn't sound hopeful. "Resistance is useless!" bellowed the guard. "Just don't say things like that," stammered Ford. "How can anyone maintain a positive mental attitude if you're saying things like that?" "My God," complained Arthur. "You're talking about a positive mental attitude and you haven't even had your planet demolished today. I woke up this morning and I thought I'd have a nice relaxed day, do a bit of reading, brush the dog, and now it's just after 4 in the afternoon and I'm already being thrown out of an alien spaceship. 6 light years from the smoking remains of the Earth." He spluttered and gurgled as the Vogon tightened his grip. "All right," said Ford. "Just stop panicking." "Who said anything about panicking?" snapped Arthur. "This is still just the culture shock. You wait till I've settled down into the situation and found my bearings. Then I'll start panicking." "Arthur, you're getting hysterical. Shut up." Ford tried desperately to think again, but was interrupted by the guard shouting again. "Resistance is useless!" "And you can shut up as well," snapped Ford. "Resistance is useless!" "Oh, give it a rest," said Ford. He twisted his head till he was looking straight up into his captor's face. A thought struck him. "Do you really enjoy this sort of thing?" he asked suddenly. The Vogon stopped dead and a look of immense stupidity seeped slowly over his face. "Enjoy?" he boomed. "What do you mean?" "What I mean," said Ford, "is does it give you a full, satisfying life? Stomping around, shouting, pushing people out of spaceships?" The Vogon stared up at the low steel ceiling, and his eyebrows almost rolled over each other. His mouth slacked. Finally, he said, "Well, the hours are good." "They'd have to be," agreed Ford. Arthur twisted his head round to look at Ford. "Ford, what are you doing?" he asked in an amazed whisper. "Oh, just trying to take an interest in the world around me, okay?" he said. "So the hours are pretty good, then?" he resumed. The Vogon stared down at him as sluggish thoughts moiled around in murky depths. "Yeah," he said, "but now you come to mention it, most of the actual minutes are pretty lousy. Except," he thought again, which required looking at the ceiling, "except some of the shouting I quite like." He filled his lungs and bellowed, "Resistance is—" "Yes, sure, yes," interrupted Ford hurriedly. "You're good at that, I can tell. But if it's mostly lousy," he said, slowly giving the words time to reach their mark, "then why do you do it? What is it? The girls? The leather? The machismo? Or do you just find that coming to terms with the mindless tedium of it all presents an interesting challenge?" Arthur looked backwards and forwards between them in bafflement. Said the guard. I don't know. I just sort of do it, really. My aunt said that spaceship guard was a good career for a young Vogon. You know, the uniform, the low-slung stun ray holster, the mindless tedium." "There you are, Arthur," said Ford with the air of someone reaching the conclusion of his argument. "You think you've got problems." Arthur rather thought he had. Apart from the unpleasant business with his home planet, the Vogon guards had half-throttled him already, and he didn't like the sound of being thrown into the space very much. "Try and understand his problem," insisted Ford. "Here he is, poor lad. His entire life's work is stamping around, throwing people off spaceships. And shouting," added the guard. "And shouting, sure," said Ford, patting the blubbery arm clamping around his neck in a friendly condescension. "And he doesn't even know why he's doing it." Arthur agreed this was very sad. He did this with a small feeble gesture because he was too asphyxiated to speak. Deep rumblings of bemusement came from the guard. "Well, now you put it like that, I suppose." "Good lad," encouraged Ford. "But all right," went on the rumblings. "So what's the alternative?" "Well," said Ford brightly but slowly, "stop doing it, of course. Tell them," he went on, "you're not going to do it anymore." He felt he ought to add something to that, but for the moment the guard seemed to have his mind occupied pondering that much. Said the guard. Well, that doesn't sound that great to me. Ford suddenly felt the moment slipping away. Now, wait a minute, he said. That's just the start, you see. There's more to it than that, you see. But at that moment, the guard renewed his grip and continued his original purpose of lugging the prisoners to the airlock. He was obviously quite touched. No, I think if it's all the same to you, he said, I'd better get you both shoved onto this airlock and then go and get on with some other bits of shouting. It wasn't all the same to Ford Prefect at all. Come on now, but look, he said less slowly, less brightly. Said Arthur, without any clear inflection. But hang on, pursued Ford. There's music and art and things to tell you about yet. Ah! Resistance is useless, bellowed the guard, and then added, You see, if I keep it up, I can eventually get promoted to senior shouting officer. And there aren't usually many vacancies for non-shouting and non-pushing people about officers, so I think I'd better stick to what I know. They had now reached the airlock, a large circular steel hatchway of massive strength and weight let into the inner skin of the craft. The guard operated a control and the hatchway swung smoothly open. But thanks for taking an interest, said the Vogon guard. Bye now. He flung Ford and Arthur through the hatchway into the small chamber within. Arthur lay panting for breath. Ford scrambled round and flung his shoulder uselessly against the reclosing hatchway. But listen, he shouted to the guard. There's a whole world you don't know anything about. Here, how's about this? Desperately, he grabbed for the only bit of culture he knew offhand. He hummed the first bar of Beethoven's Fifth. Da-da-da-dum. Doesn't that stir anything in you? No, said the guard. Not really, but I'll mention it to my aunt. If he said anything further after that, it was lost. The hatchway sealed itself tight, and all sound was lost by the faint, distant hum of the ship's engines. They were in a brightly polished cylindrical chamber about 6 feet in diameter and 10 feet long. Ford looked around it, panting. Potentially bright lad, I thought, he said, slumped against the curved wall. Arthur was still lying in the curve of the floor where he had fallen. He didn't look up, he just lay panting. We're trapped now, aren't we? Yes, said Ford. We're trapped. Well, didn't you think of anything? I thought you said you were going to think of something. Perhaps you thought of something and I didn't notice. Oh yes, I thought of something, panted Ford. Arthur looked up expectantly. But unfortunately, continued Ford, it rather involved being on the other side of this airtight hatchway. He kicked the hatch they'd just been thrown through. But it was a good idea, was it? Oh yes, very neat. What was it? Well, I hadn't worked out the details yet. Not much point now, is there? So, what happens next? Asked Arthur. Well, the hatchway in front of us will open automatically in a few moments and we will shoot out into deep space, I expect, and asphyxiate. If you take a lungful of air with you, you can last for up to 30 seconds, of course, said Ford. He stuck his hands behind his back, raised his eyebrows and started to hum an old Beetlejuicean battle hymn. To Arthur's eyes, he suddenly looked very alien. So this is it, said Arthur. We are going to die. Yes, said Ford. Except no, wait a minute. He suddenly lunged across the chamber at something behind Arthur's line of vision. What's this switch? He cried. What? Where? Cried Arthur, twisting around. No, I was only fooling, said Ford. We are going to die after all. He slumped against the wall again and carried on the tune from where he left off. You know, said Arthur, it's times like this when I'm trapped in a Vogon airlock with a man from Beetlejuice and I'm about to die of asphyxiation in deep space that I really wish I'd listened to what my mother told me when I was young. Why? What did she tell you? I don't know. I didn't listen. Oh, Ford carried on humming. This is terrific. Arthur thought to himself. Nelson's column has gone. McDonald's have gone. All that's left is me and the words mostly harmless. Any second now, all that will be left is mostly harmless. And yesterday the planet seemed to be going so well. A motor whirred. A slight hiss built into a deafening roar of rushing air as the outer hatchway opened onto an empty blackness, studded with tiny, impossibly bright points of light. Ford and Arthur popped out into space like corks from a toy gun. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is a wholly remarkable book. It has been compiled and recompiled many times over many years and under many different editorships. It contains contributions from countless numbers of travellers and researchers. The introduction begins like this. Space, it says, is big, really big. You just won't believe how vastly, hugely, mind-bogglingly big it is. I mean, you may think it's a long way down the road to the chemist, but that's just peanuts to space. Listen. And so on. After a while, the style settles down a bit and begins to tell you things that you really need to know, like the fact that the fabulously beautiful planet Bethalmium is now so worried about the cumulative erosion by 10 billion visiting tourists a year that any net imbalance between the amount you eat and the amount you excrete whilst on the planet is surgically removed from your body weight when you leave. So every time you go to the lavatory there, it is vitally important to get a receipt. To be fair though, when confronted by the sheer enormity of the distances between the stars, better minds than the one responsible for the guide's introduction have faltered. Some invite you to consider for a moment a peanut in Reading and a small walnut in Johannesburg, and other such dizzying concepts. The simple truth is that interstellar distances will not fit into the human imagination. Even light, which travels so fast that it takes most racers thousands of years to realise that it travels at all, takes time to journey between the stars. It takes 8 minutes to journey from the star Sol to the place where the Earth used to be, and 4 years more to arrive at Sol's nearest stellar neighbour, Alpha Proxima. For light to reach the other side of the galaxy, for it to reach Damagran, for instance, takes rather longer, 500,000 years. The record for hitchhiking this distance is just under 5 years, but you don't get to see much on the way. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy says that if you hold a lungful of air, you can survive in the total vacuum of space for about 30 seconds. As far as I know, that isn't true. At least as far as I've read. Apparently you need to exhale everything you can out of your chest. But I'm not an astrophysicist, so... Or a space doctor. However, it does go on to say that with space being the mind-bogglingly size it is, the chances of getting picked up by another ship within those 30 seconds are 2 to the power of 276,709 to 1 against. By a totally staggering coincidence, that is also the telephone number of an Islington flat where Arthur once went to a very good party and met a very nice girl whom he totally failed to get off with. She went off with a gatecrasher. Though the planet Earth, the Islington flat and the telephone have all now been demolished, it is comforting to reflect that they are all in some way commemorated by the fact that 29 seconds later, Ford and Arthur were rescued. Chapter 9. A computer chattered to itself in alarm as it noticed an airlock open and close itself for no apparent reason. This was because reason was in fact out to lunch. A hole had just appeared in the galaxy. It was exactly a nothingth of a second long, a nothingth of an inch wide, and quite a lot of millions of light years from end to end. As it closed up, lots of paper hats and party balloons fell out of it and drifted off through the universe. A team of seven 3-foot-high market analysts fell out of it and died, partly of asphyxiation, partly of surprise. 239,000 lightly fried eggs fell out of it too, materialising in a large wobbly heap on the famine-struck planet of Pogril in the Pansel system. The whole Pogril tribe had died out of famine, except for one man who died of cholesterol poisoning some weeks later. The nothingth of a second for which the whole existed reverberated backwards and forwards through time in a most improbable fashion. Somewhere in the deeply remote past it seriously traumatised a small random group of atoms drifting through the empty sterility of space, and made them cling together in the most extraordinarily unlikely patterns. These patterns quickly learnt to copy themselves. This was part of what was so extraordinary about the patterns, and went on to cause massive trouble on every planet that they drifted onto. That was how life began in the universe. 5 wild event maelstroms swirled in vicious storms of unreason and spewed up a pavement. On the pavement lay Ford Prefect and Arthur Dent, gulping like half-spent fish. "There you are!" gasped Ford, scrabbling for a finger-hold on the pavement as it raced through the third reach of the unknown. "I told you I'd think of something." "Oh, sure," said Arthur. "Sure. Bright idea of mine," said Ford, "to find a passing spaceship and get rescued by it." The real universe arched sickeningly away beneath them. Various pretend ones flitted silently by, like mountain goats. Primal light exploded, splattering space-time with goblets of junklet. Time blossomed, matter shrank away. The highest prime number coalesced quietly in a corner and hid itself away forever. "Oh, come off it," said Arthur. "The chances against it were astronomical." "Don't knock it, it worked," said Ford. "What sort of ship are we in?" asked Arthur as the pit of eternity yawned beneath them. "I don't know," said Ford. "I haven't opened my eyes yet." "No, nor have I," said Arthur. The universe jumped, froze, quivered, and splayed out in several unexpected directions. Arthur and Ford opened their eyes and looked about in considerable surprise. "Good God," said Arthur. "It looks just like the seafront at Southend." "Hell, I'm relieved to hear you say that," said Ford. "Why?" "Because I thought I must be going mad." "Perhaps you are. Perhaps you only thought I said it." Ford thought about this. "Well, did you say it or didn't you?" he asked. "I think so," said Arthur. "Well, perhaps we're both going mad." "Yes," said Arthur. "We'd be mad, all things considered, to think this was Southend." "Well, do you think this is Southend?" "Oh, yes. So do I. Therefore, we must be mad. Nice day for it." "Yes," said a passing maniac. "Who was that?" asked Arthur. "Who? The man with 5 heads and the elderberry bush full of kippers?" "Yes." "I don't know, just someone." "Ah." They both sat on the pavement and watched with a certain unease as huge children bounced heavily along the sand and wild horses thundered through the sky, taking fresh supplies of reinforced railings to the uncertain areas. "You know," said Arthur with a slight cough, "if this is Southend, there's something very odd about it." "You mean the way the sea stays steady as a rock and the buildings keep washing up and down?" said Ford. "Yes, I thought that was odd too. In fact," he continued, as with a huge bang Southend split itself into 6 equal segments, which danced and span giddily around each other in lewd and licentious formations, "there is something altogether very strange going on." Wild yowling noises of pipes and strings seared through the wind. Hot doughnuts popped out the road for 10 pence each. Horrid fish stormed out of the sky, and Arthur and Ford decided to make a run for it. They plunged through heavy walls of sound, mountains of archaic thought, valleys and mood music, bad shoe sessions and footling bats, and suddenly heard a girl's voice. It sounded quite a sensible voice, but it just said, 2 to the power of 100,000 to 1 against and falling, and that was all. Ford skidded down a beam of light and span round trying to find the source for the voice, but could see nothing he could seriously believe in. "What was that voice?" shouted Arthur. "I don't know," yelled Ford. "I don't know. It sounded like a measurement of probability." "Probability? What do you mean?" "Probability, you know, like 2 to 1, 3 to 1, 5 to 4 against. It said 2 to the power of 100,000 to 1 against. That's pretty improbable, you know." A 1,000,000-gallon vat of custard upended itself over them without warning. "But what does it mean?" cried Arthur. "What, the custard?" "No, the measurement of improbability." "I don't know. I don't know at all. I think we're on some kind of spaceship." "I can only assume," said Arthur, "that this is not the first-class compartment." Bulges appeared in the fabric of space-time. Great, ugly bulges. Said Arthur, as he felt his body softening and bending in unusual directions. "Southend seems to be melting away. The stars are swirling. A dust bowl. My legs are drifting off into the sunset. My left arm's come off too." A frightening thought struck him. "Hell," he said, "how am I going to operate my digital watch now?" He wound his eyes desperately around to Ford's direction. "Ford," he said, "you're turning into a penguin. Stop it." Again came the voice. 2 to the power of 75,000 to 1 against and falling. Ford waddled around his pond in a furious circle. Hey, who are you? He quacked. Where are you? What's going on, and is there any way of stopping it? Please relax, said the voice pleasantly, like a stewardess in an airliner with only one wing and 2 engines, one of which is on fire. You are perfectly safe. But that's not the point, raged Ford. The point is that I am now a perfectly safe penguin, and my colleague here is rapidly running out of limbs. It's all right, I've got them back now, said Arthur. 2 to the power of 50,000 to 1 against and falling, said the voice. Admittedly, said Arthur, they're longer than I usually like them, but... Isn't there anything, squawked Ford in avian fury, you feel you ought to be telling us? The voice cleared its throat. A giant petit four lolloped off into the distance. Welcome, the voice said, to the starship Heart of Gold. The voice continued. Please do not be alarmed, it said, by anything you see or hear around you. You are bound to feel some initial ill effects as you have been rescued from certain death at an improbability level of 2 to the power of 276,000 to 1 against, possibly much higher. We are now cruising at a level of 2 to the power of 25,000 to 1 against and falling, and we will be restoring normality just as soon as we are sure what is normal anyway. Thank you. 2 to the power of 20,000 to 1 against and falling. The voice cut out. Ford and Arthur were in a small, luminous pink cubicle. Ford was wildly excited. Arthur, he said, this is fantastic. We've been picked up by a ship powered by the infinite improbability drive. This is incredible. I heard rumours about it before. They were all officially denied, but they must have done it. They've built the improbability drive. Arthur, this is... Arthur? What's happening? Arthur jammed himself against the door to the cubicle, trying to hold it closed, but it was ill-fitting. Tiny, furry little hands were squeezing themselves through the cracks. Their fingers were ink-stained. Tiny voices chattered insanely. Arthur looked up. Ford, he said, there's an infinite number of monkeys outside who want to talk to us about the script for Hamlet they've worked out. Chapter 10. The infinite improbability drive is a wonderful new method of crossing vast interstellar distances in a mere nothingth of a second, without all the tedious mucking about in hyperspace. It was discovered by lucky chance, and then developed into a governable form of propulsion by the Galactic Government's research team on Damagran. This, briefly, is the story of its discovery. The principle of generating small amounts of finite improbability by simply hooking up the logic circuits of a Bambleweenie 5-7 sub-Meson brain to an atomic vector plotter suspended in a strong Brownian motion producer, say a nice hot cup of tea, were, of course, well understood, and such generators were often used to break the ice at parties by making all the molecules in the hostess's undergarments leap simultaneously 1 foot to the left, in accordance with the theory of indeterminacy. Many respectable physicists said that they weren't going to stand for this, partly because it was a debasement of science, but mostly because they didn't get invited to those sorts of parties. Another thing they couldn't stand was the perpetual failure they encountered in trying to construct a machine which could generate the infinite improbability field needed to flip a spaceship across the mind-paralysing distances between the furthest stars. And in the end, they grumpily announced that such a machine was virtually impossible. Then, one day, a student who had been left to sweep up the lab after a particularly unsuccessful party found himself reasoning this way. If, he thought to himself, such a machine is a virtual impossibility, then it must logically be a finite improbability. So all I have to do in order to make one is to work out exactly how improbable it is, feed that figure into the finite improbability generator, give it a fresh cup of really hot tea, and turn it on. He did this, and was rather startled to discover that he had managed to create the long sought after golden infinite improbability generator out of thin air. It startled him even more when, just after he was awarded the Galactic Institute's prize for extremely cleverness, he got lynched by a rampaging mob of respectable physicists who had finally realised that the one thing they really couldn't stand was a smart-ass. And Chapter 11. The improbability-proof control cabin of the Heart of Gold looked like a perfectly conventional spaceship, except that it was perfectly clean because it was so new. Some of the control seats hadn't had the plastic wrapping taken off yet. The cabin was mostly white, oblong, about the size of a smallish restaurant. In fact, it wasn't perfectly oblong. The two long walls were raked around in a slight parallel curve, and all the angles and corners of the cabin were contoured in excitingly chunky shapes. The truth of the matter is that it would have been a great deal simpler and more practical to build the cabin as an ordinary three-dimensional oblong room, but then the designers would have got miserable. As it was, the cabin looked excitingly purposeful, with large video screens ranged over the control and guidance system panels on the concave wall, and long banks of computers set into the convex wall. In one corner, a robot sat humped, its gleaming brushed steel head hanging loosely between its gleaming brushed steel knees. It too was fairly new, but though it was beautifully constructed and polished, it somehow looked as if the various parts of it, more or less humanoid body, didn't quite fit properly. In fact, they fitted perfectly well, but something in its bearing suggested that it might have fitted better. Zaphod Beeblebrox nervously paced up and down the cabin, brushing his hands over pieces of the gleaming equipment and giggling with excitement. Trillian sat hunched over a clump of instruments, reading off figures. Her voice was carried around the tannoy system of the whole ship. 5-1 against them falling, she said. 4-1 against them falling. 3-1. 2, 1. Probability factor of 1-1. We have normality. I repeat, we have normality. She turned her microphone off and then turned it back on with a slight smile and continued. Anything you still can't cope with is therefore your own problem. Please relax. You will be sent for soon. Zaphod burst out in annoyance. Who are they, Trillian? Trillian span a seat round to face him and shrugged. Just a couple of guys we seem to have picked up in open space, she said. Section ZZ9, plural Z Alpha. Yeah, well, that's a very sweet thought, Trillian, complained Zaphod. But do you really think it's wise under the circumstances? I mean, here we are on the run and everything. We must have the police of half the galaxy after us by now, and we stopped to pick up hitchhikers. Okay, so 10 out of 10 for style, but minus several million for good thinking, yeah? He tapped irritably at his control panel. Trillian quietly moved his hand before he tapped anything important. Whatever Zaphod's qualities of mind might include, dash, bravado, conceit, he was mechanically inept and could easily blow the ship up with an extravagant gesture. Trillian had come to suspect that the main reason why he had such wild and unsuccessful life was that he never really understood the significance of anything he did. Zaphod, she said patiently, they were floating unprotected in open space. You wouldn't want them to have died, would you? Well, you know, no, not as such, but... Not as such? Not die as such, but... Trillian cocked her head to one side. Well, maybe someone else might have picked them up later. A second later and they'd have been dead. Yeah, so if you'd taken the trouble to think about the problem a bit longer, it would have gone away. You'd have been happy to let them die? Well, you know, not happy as such, but... Anyway, said Trillian, turning back to the controls, I didn't pick them up. What do you mean? Who picked them up then? The ship did. Huh? The ship did, all by itself. Huh? Whilst we were in the improbability drive. But that's incredible. No, Zaphod, just very, very improbable. Yeah. Look, Zaphod, she said, patting his arm. Don't worry about the aliens. They're just a couple of guys, I expect. I'll send the robot down to get them and bring them up here. Hey, Marvin. Hey, Marvin. In the corner, the robot's head swung up sharply, but then wobbled about imperceptibly. It pulled itself up to its feet, as if it were about 5 pounds heavier than it actually was, and made what an outside observer would have thought to be a heroic effort to cross the room. It stopped in front of Trillian and seemed to stare through her left shoulder. I think you ought to know I'm feeling very depressed, it said. Its voice was low and hopeless. Oh, God, muttered Zaphod and slumped into a seat. Well, said Trillian in a bright, compassionate tone, here's something to occupy you and keep your mind off things. It won't work, droned Marvin. I have an exceptionally large mind. Marvin, warned Trillian. All right, what do you want me to do? Go down to number 22 entry bay and bring the 2 aliens up here for under surveillance. With a microsecond pause and a finely calculated micromodulation of pitch and timbre, nothing you could actually take offence at, Marvin managed to convey his utter contempt and horror of all things human. Just that, he said. Yes, said Trillian firmly. I won't enjoy it, said Marvin. Zaphod leapt out of his seat. She's not asking you to enjoy it, he shouted. Just do it, will you? All right, said Marvin, like the tolling of a great cracked bell. I'll do it. Good, snapped Zaphod. Great, thank you. Marvin turned and lifted his flat-topped triangular red eyes up towards him. I'm not getting you down at all, am I? He said pathetically. No, Marvin, lilted Trillian. That's just fine, really. I wouldn't like to think I was getting you down. No, don't worry about that, the lilt continued. You just act as comes naturally and everything will be just fine. You sure you don't mind? Probed Marvin. No, Marvin, lilted Trillian. That's just fine, really. Just part of life. Marvin flashed her an electronic look. Life, said Marvin. Don't talk to me about life. He turned hopelessly on his heel and lugged himself out of the cabin. With a satisfied hum and a click, the door closed behind him. I don't think I can stand that robot much longer, Zaphod, growled Trillian. I wish I could do better girl voices. Oh well. The Encyclopedia Galactica defines a robot as a mechanical apparatus designed to do the work of a man. The marketing division of the Sirius Cybernetics Corporation defines a robot as your plastic pal who's fun to be with. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy defines the marketing division of the Sirius Cybernetics Company as a bunch of mindless jerks who'll be the first against the wall when the revolution comes, with a footnote to the effect that the editors would welcome applications from anyone interested in taking over the post of robotics correspondent. Curiously enough, an edition of the Encyclopedia Galactica that had the good fortune to fall through a time warp from 1,000 years in the future defined the marketing company of the Sirius Cybernetics Corporation as a bunch of mindless jerks who were the first against the wall when the revolution came. The pink cubicle had winked out of existence. The monkeys had sunk away to a better dimension. Ford and Arthur found themselves in the embarkation area of the ship. It was rather smart. I think the ship's brand new, said Ford. How can you tell? Asked Arthur. Have you got some exotic device for measuring the age of metal? No, I just found the sales brochure lying on the floor. It's a lot of the universe can be yours stuff. Ah, look, I was right. Ford jabbed at the pages and showed it to Arthur. It says, sensational new breakthrough in improbability physics. As soon as the ship's drive reaches infinite improbability, it passes through every point in the universe. Be the envy of other major governments. Wow, this is big league stuff. Ford hunted excitedly through the technical aspects of the ship, occasionally gasping with astonishment at what he read. Clearly galactic extra-technology had moved ahead during the years of his exile. Arthur listened for a short while, but being unable to understand the vast majority of what Ford was saying, he began to let his mind wander, trailing his fingers along the edge of an incomprehensible computer bank. He reached out and pressed an invitingly large red button on a nearby panel. The panel lit up with the words, "Please do not press this button again." He shook himself. "Listen," said Ford, who was still engrossed in the sales brochure. "They make a big thing of the ship's cybernetics. A new generation of Sirius Cybernetics Corporation's robotics and computers with the new GPP feature." "GPP feature?" said Arthur. "What's that?" "Oh, it says genuine people personalities." "Oh," said Arthur. Sounds ghastly. A voice behind them said, "It is." The voice was low and hopeless and accompanied by a slight clanking sound. They span around and saw an abject steel man standing hunched in the doorway. "What?" they said. "Ghastly," continued Marvin. "It all is. Absolutely ghastly. Don't even talk about it to me. Look at this door," he said, stepping through it. The irony circuits cut into his voice modulator as he mimicked the style of the sales brochure. "All the doors in this spaceship have a cheerful and sunny disposition. It is their pleasure to open for you and their satisfaction to close again with the knowledge of a job well done." As the door closed behind them, it became apparent that it did indeed have a satisfied sigh-like quality to it. It said. Marvin regarded it with cold loathing, while his logic circuits chatted with disgust and tinkered with the concept of directing physical violence against it. Further circuits cut in, saying, "Why bother? What's the point? Nothing is worth getting involved in." Further circuits amused themselves by analysing the molecular components of the door and of the humanoid's brain cells. For a quick encore, they measured the level of hydrogen emissions in the surrounding cubic parsec of space, and then shut down again in boredom. A spasm of despair shook through the robot's body as he turned. "Come on," he droned. "I've been ordered to take you down to the bridge. Here I am, brain the size of a planet, and they ask me to take you down to the bridge. You call that job satisfaction? Because I don't." He turned and walked back to the hated door. "Excuse me," said Ford, following after him. "Which government owns this ship?" Marvin ignored him. "You watch this door," he muttered. "It's about to open again. I can tell by the intolerable air of smugness it suddenly generates." With an ingratiating little whine, the door slid open again and Marvin stomped through. "Come on," he said. The others followed quickly and the door slid back into place with pleased little clicks and whirs. "Thank you, the marketing division of the Serious Cybernetics Corporation," said Marvin, and trudged desolately up the gleaming curved corridor that stretched out before them. "Let's build robots with genuine people personalities," they said. "So they tried it out with me. I'm a personality prototype. You can tell, can't you?" Ford and Arthur muttered embarrassed little disclaimers. "I hate that door," continued Marvin. "I'm not getting you down at all, am I?" "Which government?" started Ford again. "No government owns it," snapped the robot. "It's been stolen." "Stolen?" "Stolen?" mimicked Marvin. "Who by?" asked Ford. "Zaphod Beeblebrox." Something extraordinary happened to Ford's face. At least 5 entirely separate and distinct expressions of shock and amazement piled up on it in a jumbled mess. His left leg, which was in mid-stride, seemed to have difficulty in finding the floor again. He stared at the robot and tried to entangle some dartoid muscles. "Zaphod Beeblebrox," he said weakly. "Sorry, did I say something wrong?" "Oh, hey, Ollie, sorry, I wasn't paying attention. If you're still here." "Sorry, I was a bit wrapped up in the book. I hope you're okay, and otherwise, well, take care and have a good day at work. Or whatever it is you're doing. I'll see you then, and see you next time." "Sorry, did I say something wrong?" said Marvin, dragging himself on regardless. "Pardon me for breathing, which I never do anyway, so I don't know why I bothered to say it. Oh God, I'm so depressed. Here's another of those self-satisfied doors. Life. Don't talk to me about life." "No one even mentioned it," muttered Arthur irritably. "Ford, are you all right?" Ford stared at him. "Did that robot say Zaphod Beeblebrox?" he said. Chapter 12. A loud clatter of gunk music flooded through the heart of Gold Cabin as Zaphod searched the sub-ether radio wave bands for news of himself. The machine was rather difficult to operate. For years, radios had been operated by means of pressing buttons and turning dials. Then as the technology became more sophisticated, the controls were made touch-sensitive. You merely had to brush the panels with your fingers. Now all you had to do was wave your hand in the general direction of the components and hope. It saved a lot of muscular expenditure, of course, but it meant that you had to sit infuriatingly still if you wanted to keep listening to the same program. Zaphod waved a hand and the channel switched again. More gunk music, but this time it was background to a news announcement. The news was always heavily edited to fit the rhythms of the music. And news reports brought to you here on the sub-ether wave band, broadcasting around the galaxy around the clock, squawked a voice. And we'll be saying a big hello to all intelligent life forms everywhere, and to everyone else out there. The secret is to bang the rocks together, guys. And of course, the big news story tonight is the sensational theft of the new Improbability Drive prototype ship by none other than Galactic President Zaphod Beeblebrox. And the question everyone's asking is, has the big Z finally flipped? Beeblebrox, the man who invented the pan-galactic gargle blaster, ex-confidence trickster, once described by eccentrica Golumbits as the best bang since the big one, and recently voted the worst-dressed sentient being in the known universe for the 7th time. Has he got an answer this time? We asked his private brain case specialist, Gag Halfront. The music swirled and died for a moment. Another voice broke in, presumably Halfront. He said, "Well, Zaphod's just this guy, you know." But got no further, because an electric pencil flew across the cabin and through the radio's on-off sensitive airspace. Zaphod turned and glared at Trillian. She had thrown the pencil. "Hey," he said, "what did you do that for?" Trillian was tapping her finger on a screen full of figures. "I've just thought of something," she said. "Yeah? Worth interrupting a news bulletin about me for?" "You hear yourself enough as it is." "I'm very insecure. We know that." "Can you drop your ego for a moment? This is important." "If there's anything more important than my ego around, I want it caught and shot now." Zaphod glared at her again, then laughed. "Listen," she said, "we picked up those couple of guys." "What couple of guys?" "The couple of guys we picked up." "Oh yeah," said Zaphod, "those couple of guys." "We picked them up in sector ZZ9 plural Z9 alpha." "Yeah," said Zaphod and blinked. Trillian said quietly, "Does that mean anything to you?" Said Zaphod. ZZ9 plural Z alpha. ZZ9 plural Z alpha. "Well?" said Trillian. What does the Z mean?" said Zaphod. "Which one?" "Anyone." One of the major difficulties Trillian experienced in her relationship with Zaphod was learning to distinguish between him pretending to be stupid just to get people off their guard, pretending to be stupid because he couldn't be bothered to think and wanted someone else to do it for him, pretending to be outrageously stupid to hide the fact he actually didn't understand what was going on, and really being genuinely stupid. He was renowned for being amazingly clever, and quite clearly was so, but not all the time, which obviously worried him, hence the act. He preferred people to be puzzled rather than contemptuous. This, above all, appeared to Trillian to be genuinely stupid, but she could no longer be bothered to argue about it. She sighed and punched a star map on the vis screen, so that she could make it simple for him, whatever his reasons for wanting it to be that way. "There," she pointed. "Right there." "Hey, yeah," said Zaphod. "Well?" she said. "Well, what?" Parts of the inside of her head screamed at other parts of the inside of her head. She said very calmly, "It's the same sector you originally picked me up in." He looked at her and then looked back to the screen. "Hey, yeah," he said. "Now that is wild. We should have zapped straight into the middle of the Horsehead Nebula. How did we come to be there? I mean, that's nowhere." She ignored this. "Improbability drive," she said patiently. "You explained it to me yourself. We pass through every point in the universe, you know that." "Yeah, but that's one wild coincidence, isn't it?" "Yes." "Picking someone up from that point?" Out of the whole of the universe to choose from? That's just too... I want to work this out. Computer! The Sirius Cybernetics shipboard computer, which controlled and permeated every particle of the ship, switched into communication mode. Hi there, it said, brightly, and simultaneously spewed out a tiny ribbon of ticker tape, and just for the record, the ticker tape said, Hi there. Oh God, said Zaphod. He hadn't worked with this computer for long, but he had already learned to loathe it. The computer continued, brash and cheery as if it was selling detergent. I want you to know that whatever your problem, I am here to help you with it. Yeah, said Zaphod. Look, I think I'll just use a piece of paper. Sure thing, said the computer, spilling out its message into the waste bin at the same time. I understand. If you ever want... Shut up, said Zaphod, and snatching up a pencil, he sat down next to Trillian at the console. Okay, said the computer in a hurt tone of voice, and closed down its speech channel again. Zaphod and Trillian pored over the figures. The improbability flight path scanner flashed silently up in front of them. Can we work out, said Zaphod, from their point of view what the improbability of the rescue was? Yes, that's a constant, said Trillian. 2 to the power of 276,709 to 1 against. That's high. They're 2 lucky guys. Yes, but relative to what we were doing when the ship picked them up. Trillian punched up the figures. They showed 2 to the power of infinity minus 1 to 1 against, an irrational number that only has a conventional meaning in improbability physics. It's pretty low. It's pretty low, continued Zaphod with a slight whistle. Yes, agreed Trillian, who looked at him quizzically. That's one big whack of improbability to be accounted for. Something pretty improbable has to show up on the balance sheet if it's all going to add up into a pretty sum. Zaphod scribbled a few sums, crossed them out, and threw the pencil away. Bats dues, I can't work it out. Well, Zaphod knocked his 2 heads together in irritation and gritted his teeth. Okay, he said. Computer! The voice circuit sprang to life again. Why, hello there, they said. Ticker-tape, ticker-tape. All I want to do is make your day nicer and nicer and nicer. Yeah, well, shut up and work something out for me. Sure thing, chattered the computer. You want an improbability forecast based on improbability data, yeah. Okay, the computer continued. Here's an interesting little notion. Did you realize that most people's lives are governed by telephone numbers? A pained look crawled across one of Zaphod's faces and onto the other one. Have you flipped? He said. No, but you will when I tell you that. Trillian gasped. She scrabbled at the buttons on the improbability flight path screen. Telephone number, she said. Did that thing say telephone number? Numbers flashed up on the screen. The computer had paused politely, but now it continued. What I was about to say was that... Don't bother, please, said Trillian. Look, what is this? Said Zaphod. I don't know, said Trillian, but those aliens, they're on the way to the bridge with that wretched robot. Can we pick them up on any monitor cameras? Marvin trudged on down the corridor, still moaning. And then, of course, I've got this terrible pain in all the diodes down my left-hand side. No, said Arthur grimly as he walked along beside him. Really? Oh, yes, said Marvin. I mean, I've asked for them to be replaced, but no one ever listens. I can imagine. Vague whistling and humming noises were coming from Ford. Well, 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 he kept saying to himself. Zaphod Beeblebrox. Suddenly, Marvin stopped and held up a hand. You know what's happened now, of course. No, what? Said Arthur, who didn't want to know. We've arrived at another of those doors. There was a sliding door to let into the side of the corridor. Marvin eyed it suspiciously. Well, said Ford impatiently. Do we go through? Do we go through? Mimicked Marvin. Yes. This is the entrance to the bridge. I was told to take you to the bridge. Probably the highest demand that will be made on my intellectual capacities today. I shouldn't wonder. Slowly, with great loathing, he stepped towards the door like a hunter stalking its prey. Suddenly it slid open. "Thank you," it said, "for making a simple door very happy." Deep in Marvin's thorax, gears ground. "Funny," he toned funerally, "how just when you think life can't possibly get any worse, it suddenly does." He heaved himself through the door and left Ford and Arthur staring at each other and shrugging their shoulders. From inside they heard Marvin's voice again. "I suppose you'll want to see the aliens now," he said. "Do you want me to just sit in a corner and rust? Or just fall apart where I'm standing?" "Yeah, just show them in, would you, Marvin?" came another voice. Arthur looked at Ford and was astonished to see him laughing. "What's..." "Shh," said Ford. "Come on in." He stepped through into the bridge. Arthur followed him in nervously and was astonished to see a man lolling back in a chair with his feet on a control console, picking his teeth in his right hand head with his left hand. The right hand head seemed to be thoroughly preoccupied with this task, but the left hand one was grinning a broad, relaxed, nonchalant grin. The number of things that Arthur couldn't believe he was seeing was fairly large. His jaw dropped at a loose end for a while. The peculiar man waved a lazy wave at Ford, and with an appalling affectation of nonchalance said, "Ford, hi, how are you? Glad you could drop in." Ford was not going to be outcooled. "Zaphod," he drawled. "Great to see you. You're looking well. The extra arm suits you. Nice ship you've stolen." Arthur goggled at him. "You mean you know this guy?" he said, waving a wild finger at Zaphod. "Know him?" exclaimed Ford. "He's..." He paused and decided to do the introductions the other way around. "Oh, Zaphod, this is a friend of mine, Arthur Dent," he said. "I saved him when his planet blew up." "Oh, sure," said Zaphod. "Hi, Arthur. Glad you could make it." His right-hand head looked around casually, said hi, and went back to having its teeth picked. Ford carried on. "And Arthur," he said, "this is my semi-cousin, Zaphod B." "We've met," said Arthur sharply. "When you're cruising down the road in the fast lane, you lazily sail past a few hard-driving cars and are feeling pretty pleased with yourself, and then accidentally change down from fourth into first, and instead of third, making your engine leap out of your bonnet in a rather ugly mess. It tends to throw you off your stride, in much the same way that this remark threw Ford Prefect off his. What?" he said. "I said we've met." Zaphod gave an awkward start of surprise and jabbed a gum sharply. "Hey, have we? Hey." Ford rounded on Arthur with an angry flash in his eyes. Now he felt he was back on home ground. He suddenly began to resent having lumbered himself with this ignorant primitive who knew as much about the affairs of the galaxy as an Ilford-based gnat knew about life in Peking. "Do you mean you've met?" he demanded. "This is Zaphod Beeblebrox from Beetlejuice 5, you know. Not bloody Martin Smith from Croydon." "I don't care," said Arthur coldly. "We've met, haven't we, Zaphod Beeblebrox? Or should I say, Phil?" "What?" shouted Ford. "You'll have to remind me," said Zaphod. "I have a terrible memory for species." "It was at a party," pursued Arthur. "Yeah, well, I doubt that," said Zaphod. "Cool it, will you, Arthur?" demanded Ford. Arthur would not be deterred. "A party 6 months ago, on Earth, England." Zaphod shook his head with a tight-lipped smile. "London," insisted Arthur. "Islington." "Oh," said Zaphod with a guilty start. "That party." This wasn't fair on Ford at all. He looked backwards and forwards between Arthur and Zaphod. "What?" he said to Zaphod. "You don't mean to say you've been on that miserable little planet as well, do you?" "No, of course not," said Zaphod breezily. "Well, I may have just dropped in briefly, you know, on my way somewhere." "But I was stuck there for 15 years. "Well, I didn't know that, did I?" "But what were you doing there?" Looking about, you know. He gate-crashed a party, said Arthur, trembling with anger. A fancy dress party. It wouldn't. It would have to be, wouldn't it? Said Ford. At this party, persisted Arthur, was a girl. Oh well, look, it doesn't matter now. The whole place has gone up in smoke anyway. I wish you'd stop sulking about that bloody planet, said Ford. Who was the lady? Oh, well, just somebody. Well, all right, I wasn't doing very well with her. I'd been trying to be all evening. Hell, she was something, though. Beautiful, charming, devastatingly intelligent. At least I got her to myself for a bit, and was plying her with a bit of talk, when this friend of yours barges up and says, Hey, doll, is this guy bothering you? Why don't you talk to me instead? I'm from a different planet. Different planet. I never saw her again. Zaphod? Exclaimed Ford. Yes, said Arthur, glaring at him and trying not to feel foolish. He only had 2 arms and 1 head, and he called himself Phil, but you must admit he did turn out to be from another planet, said Trillian, wandering into sight at the other end of the bridge. She gave Arthur a pleasant smile, which settled on him like a ton of bricks, and then turned her attention to the ship's controls again. There was silence for a few seconds, and then out of the scrambled mess of Arthur's brain crawled some words. Tricia Macmillan, he said. What are you doing here? Same as you, she said. I hitched the lift. After all, with a degree in maths and another in astrophysics, what else was there to do? It was either that or the doll queue again on Monday. Infinity -1, chattered the computer. Improbability sum now complete. Zaphod looked about at him. At Ford, at Arthur, and then at Trillian. Trillian, he said, is this sort of thing going to happen every time we use the improbability drive? Very probably, I'm afraid, she said. I think now at chapter 14, I'm going to leave it there for the night, because I got started later anyway. And it's almost midnight here, so yeah. I wanted to get started earlier, but was having loads of mic problems and loads of different issues with different things, and also some model calibration issues, but at least it got done. But oh well, this will be going up on YouTube afterwards anyway, so thank you for coming to watch, and if you're watching on YouTube, then thank you for taking the time to watch there instead. And I hope to see you again soon at some point. Excuse the angry face. Yeah, there we go. Anyway, yeah, so for anyone watching, I hope you have a good day or a good night or whatever it is you're going to be doing, and take care of yourselves. So good night for now. Goodbye.